So route-based lazy loading is one important lazy loading mechanism or feature offered by Angular. And it is an approach you will likely use in a lot of Angular applications. But modern Angular, so Angular projects using version 17 or higher, also offer you another way of lazy loading parts of your application. You can use deferrable views there. And that's what we'll explore next at the example of a brand new dummy demo application, which you find attached as always. And this is a very simple application that in the end only consists of 3 components. And if you install all the dependencies here, and you then start that development server, and you visit localhost 4200, you'll see this basic site on the screen. Now, here on this site, I have some sections with some dummy text, and then at the very bottom, I have this offer area where I get this progress bar, which is kind of counting down. And after this time here expired, this offer will actually become invalid, as you will see. Though it's also worth noting that clicking view offer won't do anything here, because this is just a dummy demo page, which I want to use to introduce you to this deferrable views feature. And for that, let's say that it, for example, makes no sense to show this offer here to the user if the user just loaded this page. Since we got a counter there, we might want to wait until the user scrolled down and is actually able to see that offer. Starting the timer before the user even gets there doesn't sound fair. In addition, the code for this timer is definitely not super complex, but I am using a couple of RxJS operators here to set up this timer with help of RxJS. Of course, you could do it without RxJS, but I deliberately did it like this here so that we are actually importing some code from RxJS, which we don't really need to load initially when the page just starts up. Because again, we actually don't even want to start the timer at that point. So loading this component and all the related code just when the website here becomes visible doesn't make too much sense. And that would be a perfect scenario for lazy loading this part of the page. So for lazy loading this app offer preview component here. And that's something we can do with help of this deferrable views feature. So the goal now is not to load the code that belongs to a route lazily. Indeed, I have no routes in this basic site, but instead to load this component and its related code lazily. That's the goal now. So how can we now use this deferrable views feature to lazily load this app offer preview component and all the related code? Well, simply by adding @defer to your template, and then by adding curly braces and wrapping that around the code you want to load lazily, so around the component you want to load lazily. By default, without any further configuration, Angular would now go ahead and load this component and its related code lazily once the browser enters an idle state, which in simplified terms in the end means that it's currently not performing some heavy task on your website. But defer actually also allows you to add parentheses here and define some conditions or add further configuration that configures when exactly that will be loaded. For example, you can add a trigger here by adding the on keyword and then thereafter the name of the trigger you want to react to. And as you can see on the official website, in the official documentation, there are a couple of triggers you could use. For example, on viewport, this trigger would make sure that this component is only loaded if it's scrolled into the viewport, so if the user can actually see it. Though, as you see, if you hover over a viewport, this actually requires a placeholder block, which is another feature offered by Defer. You can also add placeholder to it to define some fallback content that will be shown whilst this content here is not loaded. Like a paragraph that says we might have an offer. So this will now be shown initially, or will be rendered initially, I should say, since technically the user likely will never see it, but this will be rendered initially. But once this is scrolled into the viewport, it will be replaced with this component that is now loaded lazily on demand. With that, if you save that, if you go back and you reload this website and you then wait for a couple of seconds, so that in theory that timer of the offer would already tick down a couple of seconds. If you do all that and you then scroll down, you see it looks like the timer just started, which proves that this entire component down here was only just loaded. And you can also see that that's the case if you reload again and you open your developer tools and you go to the network tab and you then scroll down, because you should see some code chunks being loaded here. And if you inspect them, you'll see that there's quite a bit of code that is being loaded here when this component is loaded. And that also proves that lazy loading with @defer works here. In this case, with help of the viewport trigger. Now, the viewport trigger isn't the only trigger supported by this defer template instruction. Instead, as mentioned, the official documentation also gives you a list of all other triggers that are supported, and for example, on interaction could be another useful trigger. Because on interaction means that now this component and its code will be loaded once the user interacts with that placeholder. And Angular considers it an interaction if the user clicks on this element. So now if we save that, if I reload again and I scroll down, now you see that fallback text here. And actually, I'll add a class of fallback here, which is part of the starting styles I provided to make this look a bit better. At least it's centered now. But as you can see, nothing happens if this scrolls into view now. But if I click on it, then it actually is replaced with that offer preview component. And just to be really clear about that, it's also at that point of time that those requests are sent. So that's how you can lazy load components right from inside a template by using this deferrable views feature and this defer template instruction. Now, this defer template instruction, this feature is quite flexible. And I do recommend that you take a look at the official documentation to learn about all the different ways of using it and of setting up these triggers. For example, you could also connect the interaction trigger to an interaction on some other element instead of the placeholder by adding a template variable to that other element and then passing that template variable between parentheses to interaction. That's something you could do. In addition, you can also set up prefetching to speed up the loading process of that content when it's needed even more. By adding the prefetch instruction here after a semicolon, and by then defining when to prefetch, which you do by again using the on keyword and then your trigger, for example, hover. Now with that, the component would become visible if the user clicks on it, but the code for it would already be prefetched behind the scenes once the user hovers over it, hopefully giving us a small speed advantage. Which we can't really see here in the browser because everything's super fast in development with our local server anyways. Also because we're only lazy loading a small package of code here, but still, it is a pattern you could consider using. So with that, if I open this network tab here, if I hover over this, you see these requests were sent, but I didn't click on it yet, so the component is not yet visible. But once I click on it, it's there instantly, I guess just as before, because as mentioned, everything is super fast here, but technically there was a difference now, because we did prefetch this code, and we then only controlled when it would be used with this trigger. And that's essentially it for deferrable views. As mentioned, there are some other things you can configure. For example, you could also add loading to add some loading fallback and even control when exactly that will be shown. You can add an error fallback in case loading these resources goes wrong. So in case fetching the code that belongs to this component somehow fails. And you can also configure these triggers in great detail and also combine multiple triggers with each other if you want to. But chances are high that you'll typically use @defer with a relatively basic setup where you might want to load and show some content once it scrolls into the viewport or upon user interaction. And you also might want to consider prefetching the code to load it even faster. And therefore, deferrable views implemented with help of this defer template instruction can be very useful. And this is a feature that's not meant to be used instead of a route-based lazy loading, but instead in addition to route-based lazy loading, if it makes sense. Of course, just as with route-based lazy loading, it does not make sense to use defer on content that will show up anyways. Like here in my app component, this welcome component. Since the app component is the first component to be rendered when the app starts, this component here will always be rendered when the app starts, unless that's outside of the viewport or anything like that, or unless we really only want to load it once the user interacts with it. But outside of those cases, using defer here would probably not make too much sense. But there are situations where it can make sense, like here with this offer preview.